February 19, 1994, 8:15 p.m. Riverside General Hospital, California. A routine ambulance rolls through the sliding doors, carrying 31-year-old Gloria Cecilia Ramirez, semi-conscious and fighting the final stages of cervical cancer. She'd been at home that evening when her heart started racing out of control. Paramedics found her pale, struggling to breathe, her body already shutting down from the disease that had spread through her pelvis and lungs. They loaded her onto the gurney, hooked up an IV, and raced her the short distance to the ER. Nobody expected anything out of the ordinary, just another late-night cancer patient in the final weeks of her life. The trauma bay was calm when they wheeled her in. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A small team waited. Nurses, doctors, a respiratory therapist, a couple of techs. Standard Saturday night shift. Gloria's eyes fluttered open for a second as they transferred her to the exam table. Her skin looked strangely slick under the lights, almost like it had been rubbed with oil. The admitting nurse, Susan Kane, leaned in to start an IV line and immediately wrinkled her nose. A weird smell was coming off the patient. Not the usual hospital antiseptic or the metallic tang of blood. This was something sharper. Garlic mixed with ammonia, and underneath it, a faint fruity sweetness that made her stomach turn. Susan shook it off and slid the needle into Gloria's arm to draw blood for labs. The syringe filled slowly. The blood looked off, darker than normal, almost blackish in places. But what really stopped her was the tiny manila-colored crystals floating inside the tube, like fine sand suspended in the fluid. Susan held the syringe up to the light, frowning. "What the hell is this?" she muttered. Before anyone could answer, the smell hit her full force. Her eyes burned like someone had sprayed pepper spray directly into them. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Then her knees buckled. She dropped the syringe and collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Chaos didn't explode right away. It crept in, one person at a time. Respiratory therapist Maureen Welch stepped forward to help, thinking maybe Susan had just fainted from the long shift. She bent down, caught a full whiff of that same garlic ammonia stench rising from Gloria's body, and felt her own vision tunnel. Her chest seized. She started gasping, then dropped beside Susan, her body jerking in convulsions. Dr. Humberto Ochoa, the senior physician on duty that night, barked orders to get oxygen on both women. He moved closer to Gloria to check her vitals, and that's when it really began. The oily sheen on her skin seemed to thicken under the heat of the lights. The smell grew stronger, filling the entire bay. One by one, the rest of the team started feeling it. A nurse's eyes streamed tears. A tech clutched his chest, complaining of burning lungs. Another doctor staggered backward, his face turning ashen. Within minutes, 5 more people were on the floor. Some unconscious, some vomiting, some fighting for air like they'd been gassed. The ER chairman, Dr. Michael Good, took one look at the scene unfolding and made the call no one ever wants to make. "Evacuate," he ordered. "Everybody out, now." Alarms blared. Security rushed in. Patients in the waiting room were wheeled outside in their gowns, IV poles clattering across the pavement. The entire emergency department, doctors, nurses, techs, even the security guards, poured into the parking lot, while a skeleton crew in makeshift protective gear stayed behind to fight for Gloria's life. They sealed the doors. Hazmat protocols kicked in, even though no one knew what they were dealing with. This wasn't a drill. This was real. Outside in the cold night air, the staff who had collapsed sat on the curb or lay on stretchers, still coughing, still burning, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. They weren't civilians. These were trained professionals who dealt with blood, vomit, and trauma every single day. Yet something inside that room had turned one dying woman into a walking chemical weapon. Her blood, her skin, even the air around her seemed toxic. and Gloria herself was still fighting. Monitors showed her heart rhythm going wild. She was in full cardiac arrest now. The remaining team worked frantically in their gloves and masks, defibrillating her, pumping oxygen, trying desperately to keep her alive while the rest of the hospital held its breath. By 8:50 p.m., just 35 minutes after she rolled through those doors, Gloria Cecilia Ramirez was pronounced dead. Her body was sealed in 3 layers of plastic shrouds, then placed inside a biohazard container. No one dared touch it without full protective gear. The ER remained locked down for hours, while hazmat teams swept the room for any trace of whatever had just poisoned 23 trained medical workers. Blood samples from Gloria had already been rushed to the lab, but early reports were coming back clean. No conventional poisons, no radiation, no biological agents anyone recognized. Word spread fast. By midnight, local news vans were lining the street outside the hospital. Reporters were already calling her the toxic lady. Inside the sealed building, the questions multiplied. How does one woman, dying of cancer, walk into an ER and take down an entire trauma team without a single conventional toxin showing up in the tests? Was it something she had been exposed to at home? A secret government experiment gone wrong? Or had she somehow become the carrier of a brand new chemical nightmare no one had ever seen before? The staff who collapsed that night would later describe the same exact symptoms: burning eyes, choking throats, convulsions, temporary paralysis. They weren't imagining it. Their medical charts proved it. Some were hospitalized for days. One doctor suffered permanent lung damage. Yet the patient at the center of it all had died without any obvious cause beyond her cancer. And the mystery was only beginning. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the opening act. The parking lot outside Riverside General had turned into a makeshift field hospital by 9:30 p.m. 23 members of the ER team were down, some still unconscious, others retching into plastic bags, eyes swollen shut from whatever had burned through the air in Trauma Bay 1. Paramedics who had just dropped Gloria off were now treating their own colleagues. One nurse sat on the curb, whispering the same phrase over and over. It came out of her skin. It came right out of her skin. Inside the sealed trauma bay, the skeleton crew worked in full hazmat suits they had grabbed from the decontamination closet. The air handlers had been shut off to keep whatever toxin was in there from spreading through the hospital's vents. Gloria lay on the table, her body still warm, the monitors flatlining for the 3rd time. Every time they shocked her, the oily film on her chest seemed to shimmer brighter under the overhead lights. The smell had become unbearable even through the respirators. Garlic, ammonia, and that sickly sweet undertone that reminded the hazmat tech of rotting fruit mixed with industrial solvent. Dr. Good stood at the door in his suit, watching through the glass. He had ordered the blood samples rushed to the lab under triple containment. The syringe Susan Kane had dropped still lay on the floor, the manila crystals now settled at the bottom like sediment in a forgotten vial. A second wave hit just before 9 p.m. Maureen Welch, who had regained consciousness for a few minutes, suddenly seized again. 2 more nurses who had only been in the bay for seconds earlier now collapsed outside, complaining that the burning in their lungs had followed them into the night air. It was as if the toxin had clung to their clothes, their hair, their very breath. By midnight, the county hazmat team had arrived in full Level A gear, bright yellow suits, self-contained breathing apparatus, the works. They swept the room with every detector they had. Chemical warfare agents, volatile organics, radiation, biological markers. Every reading came back negative. The only thing they found was that strange oily residue on Gloria's arms and torso, now hardening into a waxy film. They scraped samples into sealed containers and labeled them unknown substance, extreme caution. Gloria's body was zipped into 3 body bags, one inside the other, then loaded into a biohazard transport van headed for the county coroner's office under police escort. No one was taking chances. Back in the parking lot, the injured staff were being loaded into ambulances headed for other hospitals. 5 of them were critical: respiratory failure, cardiac arrhythmias, one doctor with chemical burns on his corneas that would leave him with permanent vision damage. The rest were stable but terrified. They kept asking the same questions the reporters were already shouting from behind the yellow tape. What the hell was that? How does a dying woman poison an entire ER without any poison showing up? By sunrise, the story had exploded. Local TV stations led with "Mystery toxin fells hospital staff. Patient called the toxic lady." Helicopters circled the hospital. National networks picked it up by noon. Inside the Ramirez family home, Gloria's husband, her mother and her sister sat in stunned silence watching the news. Her husband, a quiet man who had cared for her through months of chemotherapy, told a reporter later that night, "She was just sick. She wasn't dangerous. This hospital did something to her, or they're hiding something." The family insisted Gloria had followed every doctor's order, taken only her prescribed pain meds and supplements. No strange chemicals, no secret experiments. But the rumors inside the hospital were already running wild. Nurses whispered in the staff lounge that the crystals in the blood looked exactly like something they had seen in chemical weapon training videos from the Gulf War. One doctor, who had been in the bay, swore the oily sheen reminded him of dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, an industrial solvent sometimes used off-label by cancer patients desperate for pain relief. But when he mentioned it to the hazmat team, they shut him down fast. "We tested for everything," they said. "Nothing." Early toxicology reports from the state lab came back the next day. Clean. No heavy metals, no pesticides, no nerve agents, no radiation. The blood cultures showed only the expected signs of advanced cervical cancer, nothing exotic. The coroner's preliminary ruling was blunt. Gloria had died of cardiac arrest due to her terminal illness. The staff illnesses? Mass sociogenic illness. In other words, mass hysteria. The doctors and nurses who had watched their colleagues drop like flies were furious. "We didn't imagine the burning in our lungs," one told a reporter. "We didn't imagine the convulsions. 23 of us, at the same time, from one patient." The more the officials pushed the hysteria explanation, the louder the conspiracy theories grew. Online bulletin boards, still new in 1994, lit up with posts claiming Gloria had been part of a secret government bioweapons test. Riverside was only an hour from several military bases. Maybe she had been exposed to some experimental chemical during a botched trial and the hospital was ordered to cover it up. Others pointed to the crystals and the smell and swore it had to be extraterrestrial. "Alien contact residue," one tabloid headline screamed. The toxic lady was patient zero for something not of this earth. Even the more grounded theories sounded insane. Some said the hospital itself had a toxic spill in the vents, and Gloria's arrival was just the trigger that exposed it. Others claimed her cancer treatments had interacted with something in the ER air, maybe a faulty oxygen tank, and created a brand new supertoxin on the spot. The family hired a lawyer within 48 hours, demanding independent tests on Gloria's tissues. The hospital stonewalled, citing biohazard protocols. Meanwhile, the staff who had been hospitalized started comparing notes. Every single one of them described the exact same progression. Eyes burning first, then throat closing, then the metallic taste, then collapse. The ones who had only smelled it second-hand still got sick. It was as if the toxin had a mind of its own, lingering, spreading, attacking anyone who came near that body. By the end of the first week, Riverside General was a ghost town in the ER wing. Clean-up crews in full moon suits scrubbed every surface 3 times. The trauma bay was taped off and labelled a permanent biohazard zone. And still, no one could explain how one 31-year-old woman with terminal cancer, had walked into a hospital and turned it into a war zone. The toxic lady had died. But the mystery she left behind was very much alive, and it was only getting stranger. The weeks that followed turned Riverside General into ground zero for one of the strangest medical mysteries of the decade. The hospital reopened the ER after 3 days of frantic decontamination, but the trauma bay where Gloria had died stayed sealed behind yellow tape and warning signs. Staff who returned to work moved like ghosts through the hallways, trading whispered stories in the break room. They all remembered the same details. The way the oily film on her skin had seemed to bubble slightly when the defibrillator paddles touched it. The way the crystals in the syringe had sparkled under the lights like tiny shards of glass. And above all, that smell. Garlic, ammonia, and something sweet and rotten that clung to their clothes for days, no matter how many times they washed. The county coroner's office released its first official statement on February 23rd. Gloria Cecilia Ramirez, age 31, had died of natural causes related to her advanced cervical cancer. The staff illnesses were chalked up to mass sociogenic illness, a polite way of saying the whole thing was in their heads. The report cited stress, poor ventilation, and the power of suggestion. 23 trained medical professionals, it implied, had simply panicked and convinced themselves they were being poisoned by a dying woman. The backlash was immediate and furious. Doctors and nurses who had been hospitalized went public with their medical records. Blood gases showed real chemical pneumonitis. EKGs revealed arrhythmias that had never existed before that night. One respiratory therapist, Maureen Welch, spent 11 days in intensive care with seizures that the neurologists could not explain. Another nurse developed permanent corneal scarring. These were not imaginary symptoms. The American College of Emergency Physicians issued a rare public rebuke, calling the hysteria diagnosis insulting and demanding an independent investigation. Inside the hospital, morale collapsed. Nurses called in sick in record numbers. Some filed workers' compensation claims, citing toxic exposure of unknown origin. The union threatened a walkout unless the building was torn down and rebuilt. Meanwhile, the Ramirez family refused to stay silent. Gloria's husband appeared on local news channels with red eyes and a trembling voice. "My wife was not a chemical weapon," he said. "She was a mother. She was a fighter. Whatever happened in that room, the hospital created it, or they're covering it up." Her mother added fuel to the fire in a tearful interview. Gloria had been using only what the doctors prescribed. No street drugs. No weird home remedies. If there was something in her blood, it came from the cancer treatments or from that hospital. The family's lawyer filed a formal demand for Gloria's tissue samples and threatened to sue for wrongful death if the hospital had mishandled hazardous materials. That was all the tabloids needed. Within 48 hours, the story went national. "Toxic lady poisons ER," screamed the headlines. Cable news ran grainy reenactments showing actors collapsing in slow motion while dramatic music swelled. Talk radio hosts took calls from listeners who claimed to have inside information. One retired military medic swore the symptoms matched exposure to a Soviet-era nerve agent called Novichok, something the public had never heard of in 1994. Another caller, identifying himself as a former lab technician at a defense contractor near Riverside, said Gloria's blood crystals looked identical to residues from experimental rocket fuel. Conspiracy websites, still mostly on dial-up bulletin boards, began archiving every scrap of leaked paperwork. Someone posted what they claimed were the original hazmat team logs showing trace dimethyl compounds that the official reports later omitted. Whether real or fabricated, the files spread like wildfire. The wildest theories took on a life of their own. One popular narrative claimed Gloria had been an unwitting test subject in a classified Pentagon program studying battlefield chemical agents. Riverside sat less than 50 miles from Edwards Air Force Base and several desert testing ranges where exotic compounds had been dispersed in the 1980s. Maybe she had been exposed years earlier during a secret trial of a new incapacitating agent. When her body finally broke down from cancer, the stored toxin allegedly leached out in one catastrophic release. Others went further. The oily sheen and the crystals matched descriptions of angel hair residue reported in UFO encounters. One fringe researcher insisted Gloria had been abducted, injected with an extraterrestrial biomarker, and then returned, only for the substance to activate under the stress of her final illness. The garlic ammonia smell, they pointed out, was identical to odors described in dozens of close encounter cases. Even the more rational voices sounded unhinged. Chemists writing letters to the editor suggested Gloria's cancer drugs had reacted with something in the ER oxygen supply, creating a volatile organosulfur compound on the spot. Environmental activists claimed the hospital's old plumbing had leached industrial solvents into the water lines, and Gloria's arrival had simply agitated the mixture. Every theory shared one common thread. The official story was a lie. The government, the hospital, or both were hiding the truth to avoid a massive lawsuit or national panic. By mid-March, the story had crossed the Atlantic. British tabloids called it the Poison Widow from California. Japanese television ran a prime-time special with actors in hazmat suits. Inside the sealed coroner's freezer, Gloria's body waited under triple containment, while lawyers argued over who could perform the next round of tests. The family wanted their own independent pathologist. The state wanted everything kept under lock and key. And still the staff who had been there that night could not sleep without seeing her face. The pale skin glistening under the lights, the syringe in Susan Kane's hand, the moment everything went black. The mystery had reached its absolute peak. 23 people poisoned, a woman dead on the table, no toxin identified, no explanation accepted. The toxic lady had become a modern legend, a warning that something in our everyday world could turn lethal in the blink of an eye. And then, quietly, almost without fanfare, the scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory stepped in. They had been asked, off the record at first, to run one final set of tests on the few remaining tissue samples. What they found would change everything. But before anyone could breathe a sigh of relief, the world had already made up its mind. Gloria Ramirez had been a walking biohazard, and somebody, somewhere, knew exactly why. The stage was set for the biggest pivot this case had ever seen. The outrage hit like a second wave of the toxin itself. By late March 1994, the sealed trauma bay at Riverside General Hospital had become a shrine to the unknown. Yellow caution tape still crisscrossed the double doors. Inside, every surface had been scrubbed raw, yet the faint garlic ammonia ghost of that night still lingered in the air handlers. 23 staff members had been poisoned. 5 remained hospitalized with lingering lung damage, seizures, and chemical burns on their eyes that ophthalmologists could not fully explain. Gloria Cecilia Ramirez had been dead for 5 weeks, her body locked away in a triple-bagged steel vault at the coroner's office under armed guard. And still, the official story refused to budge. Natural causes for her, mass hysteria for everyone else. The hospital's press conference on March 28th only poured gasoline on the fire. The chief administrator stood behind a podium flanked by county health officials and read from a prepared statement. "There is no evidence of any chemical or biological agent," he said, voice flat. The symptoms were psychogenic, triggered by stress and suggestion. He cited the clean toxicology screens, the negative hazmat sweeps, the fact that no other patients or visitors had been affected. Then he added the line that would be replayed on every news cycle for the next year. This was a tragic but contained medical event, nothing more. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions about the oily sheen, the floating crystals, the identical symptoms reported by people who had never even entered the bay. One nurse who had collapsed that night stood up from the back row, still wearing dark glasses to hide her scarred corneas. "I didn't suggest myself into convulsions," she said, voice cracking but steady. "I didn't suggest my colleagues into the ICU. Tell that to my kids who watched me stop breathing on the sidewalk." Cameras flashed. The clip went viral before viral was even a word. Overnight, the toxic lady became a national symbol of official incompetence, or worse, deliberate cover-up. Petitions with 50,000 signatures demanded a federal investigation. The Ramirez family's lawyer held a press conference outside the coroner's office, waving a copy of the autopsy report. "My client's wife was treated like a bioweapon," he declared. "They sealed her body like it was radioactive. If there was nothing there, why the hazmat suits? Why the armed escort? Why won't they release the full tissue samples to an independent lab?" Gloria's sister stood beside him, holding up a framed photo of her smiling at a family barbecue just months earlier. "She was 31 years old," she said. "She deserved better than to be turned into a monster story." Inside the medical community, the backlash was even sharper. The Journal of Emergency Medicine published an open letter signed by more than 200 physicians calling the mass hysteria diagnosis medically irresponsible and professionally insulting. They pointed out that mass psychogenic illness typically affects people who share a belief system or in close social clusters, not a random mix of doctors, nurses, techs, and paramedics who had never met before that shift. The symptoms had been too specific, too consistent, too physiological. Real chemical pneumonitis does not care about suggestion. The conspiracy boards lit up hotter than ever. One theory now claimed the hospital had accidentally exposed Gloria to a classified nerve agent simulant during a joint military-civilian training exercise the week before. Another insisted the crystals were microscopic tracking devices from a government implant program. A late-night radio host interviewed an anonymous source who swore he had seen the hazmat logs and that they listed elevated organosulfur compounds before the data mysteriously vanished from the system. Every new leak, every new anonymous tip made the official silence sound guiltier. And then, on April 12th, something shifted behind the scenes. A quiet request went out from the California Department of Health Services to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, one of the most secure, most advanced research facilities in the United States. Livermore was where the government designed nuclear warheads and analyzed chemical weapons from foreign adversaries. They did not take on random hospital mysteries, but this case had rattled enough people in Sacramento that someone high up made a single phone call. A small team of forensic chemists and toxicologists was cleared to receive the last remaining tissue samples, the sealed blood vials, and the mysterious oily residue scraped from Gloria's skin. The transfer happened under federal courier in locked coolers marked Priority Biohazard, Eyes Only. No press release, no announcement. The public still believed the story was dead, buried under the hysteria label. But inside a windowless lab in Livermore, California, a senior chemist named Dr. Patrick M. Grant opened the first container and stared at the waxy film inside. He had been briefed on the symptoms, the crystals, the smell. He had seen the eyewitness statements. And he knew, the moment the sample hit the air, that this was no mass delusion. What happened next would take 3 years to reach the public, but in that moment, the peak of the mystery finally met its match. The era of wild theories was about to end, not with a government confession or an alien autopsy, but with something far more dangerous: cold, reproducible science. The pivot had begun. While the public was still chasing shadows of government cover-ups and alien biomarkers, a small team of chemists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory had already begun the quiet work that would close the case. Dr. Patrick M. Grant, a forensic scientist at the lab's Forensic Science Center, received the last sealed samples in April 1994, under strict federal protocols. No fanfare, no press, just vials of tissue, blood residue, and the waxy film scraped from Gloria Ramirez's skin. Grant and his colleagues ran the samples through gas chromatography mass spectrometry, the gold standard for identifying unknown compounds. What they found was not some exotic bioweapon or extraterrestrial residue. It was something far more ordinary, yet under the exact conditions of that chaotic night, something that turned lethal. The first clue was dimethylsulfone, DMSO2, detected at unusually high levels in Gloria's blood and bile. Dimethylsulfone is a crystalline solid that forms when dimethyl sulfoxide, better known as DMSO, gets oxidized. DMSO itself is a cheap industrial solvent derived from wood pulp. It has been used since the 1960s as a topical pain reliever, especially by people with chronic conditions like arthritis or late-stage cancer. Cancer patients in the early 90s often turned to it when prescription painkillers fell short. You rubbed the clear, oily liquid on your skin, and it penetrated straight through, carrying relief deep into tissues. It was cheap, it was available over the counter in some health stores, and it left a distinctive, garlic-like odor on the breath and skin. Exactly the smell multiple nurses described that night. The oily sheen on Gloria's body, that was DMSO itself, still present in high concentration because her kidneys, ravaged by metastatic cancer, could no longer clear it from her system. Grant's team pieced together the timeline with clinical precision. Gloria had almost certainly been applying DMSO cream at home for her escalating pelvic and bone pain. Paramedics gave her supplemental oxygen in the ambulance, pure O2 flowing across her skin and into her lungs. That oxygen began the first oxidation step, DMSO to dimethylsulfone. The sulfone is stable at body temperature, but crystallizes quickly once the blood cools to room temperature. That explains the manila-colored crystals Susan Kane saw floating in the syringe the moment she drew blood. The blood had left Gloria's 98.6-degree body and hit the cooler air of the trauma bay. Crystals formed instantly, but the real danger came in the next step. Under the specific conditions inside Trauma Bay 1, defibrillator shocks delivering electrical energy, the slight vacuum inside the syringe, and the rapid temperature drop, dimethylsulfone underwent a further, rare oxidation to dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate, chemical formula CH3,2SO4, is no joke. It is a powerful alkylating agent, listed in military toxicology manuals as a chemical warfare simulant. It is volatile, meaning it turns into a gas at room temperature. It is extremely irritating to eyes, skin, and lungs. In small concentrations, it causes exactly the cascade the staff experienced: immediate burning in the eyes, choking sensation in the throat, metallic taste, nausea, convulsions, and in heavier exposures, respiratory failure and cardiac arrhythmias. It is also environmentally unstable. It breaks down fast once it reacts with water or tissue, leaving behind sulfate ions and methanol. That is why standard hazmat detectors found nothing. By the time the county team arrived, the dimethyl sulfate had already hydrolyzed and vanished. The clincher came from the blood chemistry. Grant's analysis showed sulfate anion levels in Gloria's samples that were dramatically elevated, far beyond anything explained by her cancer or normal metabolism. Sulfate is the direct hydrolysis product of dimethyl sulfate. It was the smoking gun. The symptoms matched the toxicology profile of dimethyl sulfate exposure, point for point. Burning eyes, classic lacrimator effect, convulsions and collapse, central nervous system irritation. The fact that some staff who only smelled the air second-hand still got sick. The gas is heavier than air and lingers near the floor and the patient's body. Even the garlic, ammonia, fruity odor lined up. DMSO itself smells of garlic. Dimethyl sulfone contributes a sweet note, and dimethyl sulfate adds a sharp, acrid edge. This was not guesswork. Grant's team replicated the final oxidation step in a controlled lab setting using the same temperature swing and electrical simulation. They produced trace dimethyl sulfate from dimethyl sulfone under conditions that mirrored the ER that night. The 1997 peer-reviewed paper in Forensic Science International laid it all out in dry, technical language. The hypothetical scenario depends upon the oxidation of a common solvent, dimethyl sulfoxide, through dimethyl sulfone to dimethyl sulfate. The descriptions of the symptoms of the hospital staff victims appear quite consistent with dimethyl sulfate exposures. No conspiracy, no cover-up, just a perfect storm of a home remedy, end-stage kidney failure, supplemental oxygen, and the precise physics of a blood draw in a busy trauma bay. The family's denial that Gloria had ever used DMSO made sense too. In 1994, many patients kept alternative treatments secret from doctors, fearing judgment or interference with official care. DMSO carried a stigma. It had been restricted by the FDA in the 1960s after animal studies showed eye changes, though it was still widely used off-label. Gloria's relatives may never have known she was applying it, or they simply didn't connect the dots. The hospital had no reason to suspect it either. No one asks a dying cancer patient for a full inventory of every cream she rubbed on at home. The science was elegant, reproducible, and devastatingly simple. It explained every strange observation without invoking secret labs or extraterrestrials. Yet for years, the public clung to the older narrative. The Livermore report sat quietly in forensic textbooks, while tabloids kept selling the toxic lady as unsolved. The pivot was complete, but acceptance would take longer. But to truly bury the conspiracy theories, the Livermore team had to go further than just naming the compounds. They had to prove the entire chain could happen inside a real human body, under the exact conditions of that February night. And they did. Dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, had been a darling of alternative medicine since the 1960s. Developed originally as an industrial solvent from wood pulp, it was discovered to penetrate skin like almost nothing else on Earth. Rub it on your arm, and within minutes, you can taste garlic on your breath. Doctors used it experimentally for everything from arthritis to interstitial cystitis. Cancer patients, especially those in the final stages, when morphine barely touched the pain, turned to it in droves. It was cheap, legal in many states as a veterinary liniment, and available at health food stores. Gloria Ramirez had been battling advanced cervical cancer that had already spread to her lungs and bones. Her kidneys were failing, her liver was struggling. In that kind of metabolic chaos, DMSO doesn't clear the body the way it would in a healthy person. It builds up. And when paramedics hooked her to high-flow oxygen in the ambulance, the first oxidation began. Here is the precise chemical dance that Grant's team reconstructed. DMSO, formula CH3-2SO, loses 2 hydrogen atoms and gains an oxygen when exposed to air or pure oxygen, turning into dimethyl sulfone, CH3-2SO2. That is the stable white crystalline powder doctors sometimes call MSM today. It forms fast at room temperature, which is why Susan Kane saw those manila-colored crystals floating in the syringe the instant the blood cooled. But the story does not stop there. Under a combination of electrical energy from the defibrillator shocks, the slight vacuum inside the syringe, and the rapid temperature swing from body heat to trauma bay air, dimethyl sulfone can oxidize one more time into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is the villain in this story. It is a clear, oily liquid at room temperature that evaporates into a heavy, invisible gas. It is listed on every chemical weapon reference table as a potent alkylating agent, exactly the class of compounds that attack eyes, lungs, and mucous membranes on contact. A single breath of it causes immediate lacrimation, burning tears. Another breath, and the throat clamps shut. Higher concentrations trigger convulsions, respiratory arrest, and cardiac arrhythmias. The gas is heavier than air, so it pools around the patient's body and the floor of the trauma bay. That explains why some staff who never touched Gloria still collapsed minutes later. It also explains why the county hazmat team, arriving almost an hour after the first collapse, found nothing on their standard detectors. Dimethyl sulfate is notoriously unstable in the presence of water or biological tissue. It hydrolyzes, breaks down into sulfuric acid and methanol within minutes, leaving behind nothing but elevated sulfate ions. And that is exactly what Grant's lab found in the archived tissue samples. Sulfate levels off the charts, far beyond anything cancer or normal metabolism could produce. Every symptom reported that night maps perfectly onto dimethyl sulfate exposure. Burning eyes? Classic first effect. Dimethyl sulfate is a powerful lacrimator. Choking and metallic taste? Direct irritation of the upper airways. Convulsions and collapse? Central nervous system depression. The 5 staff members who ended up in intensive care showed exactly the lab abnormalities seen in documented industrial accidents involving the same compound. Low oxygen saturation, elevated white cell counts from chemical pneumonitis, and in one case, persistent corneal opacities. Even the oily sheen on Gloria's skin fits. DMSO itself is an oily liquid that lingers when the body can no longer metabolize it. Skeptics inside the chemistry community pushed back at first. Some organic chemists argued the final oxidation step from sulfone to sulfate required conditions too extreme for an ER. Grant's team answered by replicating the reaction in their lab using nothing more exotic than a temperature-controlled chamber, a syringe with a partial vacuum, and a low-voltage electrical field to mimic the defibrillator paddles. They produced measurable dimethyl sulfate in under 10 minutes. The paper they published in 1997 in Forensic Science International was only 8 pages long, but it was airtight. No speculation, no drama, just the data, the equations, and the conclusion that this was the most plausible explanation anyone had ever offered. What about the family's insistence that Gloria had never used DMSO? That too fits the pattern. In 1994, alternative remedies carried a stigma. Patients often hid them from their oncologists, fearing the doctor would dismiss the treatment or alter the official protocol. Gloria's husband and mother may genuinely never have known, or they may have been protecting her memory from being labeled the woman who poisoned an ER with snake oil. Either way, the toxicology did not need their confirmation. The metabolites were there in black and white. The early hospital tests missed it because nobody was looking for this pathway. Standard tox screens in 1994 targeted street drugs, heavy metals, pesticides, and known nerve agents. Dimethyl sulfate is not on any routine panel. It evaporates before most instruments can catch it. The crystals were dismissed as unidentified precipitate. The smell was written off as unusual body odor from end-stage disease. Hindsight is 20/20, but in the heat of that Saturday night, with people dropping all around them, the staff had no reason to suspect a common pain cream had become a chemical weapon. The Livermore findings did not make the mystery vanish overnight. Tabloids kept running "Toxic Lady Still Unsolved" stories for years. Some online forums still do. But within the medical and forensic community, the case was closed. The toxic lady had not been part of a government experiment. She had not been exposed to alien residue. She had simply been a desperate woman using a desperate remedy in a body that was already falling apart. The reaction that followed was rare. Maybe 1 in a million, but every link in the chain was ordinary, documented, and reproducible. Science had done its job. It had taken the impossible and made it merely improbable. Yet the fear that gripped that ER in 1994 was never imaginary. The pain those nurses and doctors felt was real. The courage they showed while trying to save her life was real. And the lesson that emerged from the rubble of conspiracy theories is one we still wrestle with today. The full forensic conclusion landed like a quiet detonation in the summer of 1997, 3 full years after the chaos in Trauma Bay 1. Dr. Patrick M. Grant and his Lawrence Livermore team published their peer-reviewed findings in Forensic Science International, and the 8-page paper did what no press conference or official statement ever could. It explained every single bizarre detail without a single loose end. The toxic lady had not carried a secret government weapon. She had not been dosed with extraterrestrial sludge. She had simply been using dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, as a desperate, unapproved topical pain reliever for the crushing agony of terminal cervical cancer. Her failing kidneys could not clear the stuff. Pathetics flooded her with pure oxygen. The blood cooled in the syringe. The defibrillator shocks supplied the final spark. And in that precise sequence, DMSO oxidized first to dimethyl sulfone, the manila crystals floating in the blood. Then, in a rare final step, to dimethyl sulfate, a volatile, heavy gas that behaves exactly like a chemical warfare agent in small concentrations. The gas poured off her body, heavier than air, pooling around the gurney and the floor. It burned eyes on contact, clamped throats shut, triggered convulsions, and sent 5 people to intensive care. Then it hydrolyzed away, leaving behind nothing but elevated sulfate ions that the early tox screens were never designed to catch. Grant's lab reproduced the entire chain in a controlled environment, using nothing more exotic than a temperature-controlled chamber, a syringe under partial vacuum, and a low-voltage electrical pulse to mimic the defibrillator paddles. The results were identical. The 1997 paper laid it out in the driest scientific language possible. The symptoms, the metabolites, the sulfate spike, all matched dimethyl sulfate exposure down to the last decimal point. No speculation, no drama, just the data, the equations, and the conclusion that this was the only explanation that fit every fact on the table. The family's fierce denial that Gloria had ever touched DMSO was understandable, even predictable. In 1994, alternative remedies still carried a heavy stigma. Patients often kept them secret from their oncologists, fearing judgment or interference with the official protocol. DMSO was sold as a veterinary liniment in many states. It was cheap, it worked fast, and it left that unmistakable garlic odor on the breath. Gloria's relatives may never have known she was rubbing it on her skin every night, or they may have chosen to protect her memory from being remembered as the woman who accidentally gassed an ER. Either way, the science did not need their confirmation. The metabolites were in the tissue samples. The sulfate levels were undeniable. The reaction had happened, whether anyone admitted the cream or not. Skeptics still tried to poke holes. Some organic chemists argued the final oxidation step required conditions too extreme for a busy emergency room. Grant's replication experiments shut that down cold. Others claimed the case was still unsolved because the exact concentration of dimethyl sulfate was never measured in real time. True enough, by the time hazmat arrived, the gas had already broken down, but the downstream evidence was overwhelming. The staff's medical records showed chemical pneumonitis, corneal burns, and arrhythmias that matched documented industrial accidents with the same compound. The oily sheen, the crystals, the smell, the timing, everything aligned. The probability of this exact sequence occurring was vanishingly small, but Gloria's body had been the perfect storm. End-stage kidney and liver failure to trap the DMSO, supplemental oxygen to start the oxidation, a rapid temperature drop in the trauma bay, electrical energy from the defibrillator, and a syringe vacuum that nudged the final step. It was like winning a terrible lottery with tickets no one knew they had bought. Importantly, the Livermore findings never dismissed the suffering of the 23 men and women who collapsed that night. Their pain was real. Their hospitalizations were real. Their courage, staying behind in makeshift hazmat gear to keep shocking Gloria's heart even while their own lungs burned, was heroic. Science did not call them hysterical. It simply showed that the toxin had come from an unexpected source, not from a conspiracy or a cover-up. The hospital had not lied, it had simply lacked the right test at the right moment. The coroner had not conspired, he had followed the evidence available in 1994. The mass sociogenic label had been a placeholder, a reasonable guess when every standard screen came back clean. 3 years later, the placeholder was replaced by hard chemistry. The case was closed. The toxic lady had been a tragic medical anomaly, not a weaponized patient or an alien vector. The ER had not been attacked by the government or visited by extraterrestrials. It had simply witnessed one of those vanishingly rare moments when the ordinary becomes deadly through a chain of events no one could have predicted. The mystery that had gripped the nation, spawned tabloid empires, and haunted the staff for years finally had its answer. Not in a leaked document or a deathbed confession, but in a peer-reviewed journal that most people would never read. And yet, the story refused to die in the public imagination. Even after the paper came out, websites and late-night shows still whispered about government experiments and suppressed files. Some families still believed their loved one had been poisoned by something darker. That refusal to let go is human. When something this strange happens, the mind reaches for the dramatic explanation because the quiet one feels too small to carry the weight of 23 collapsing professionals and a sealed biohazard body bag rolling out into the California night. But the science stood firm. The reaction had been real. The fear had been real, and the truth, when it finally arrived, was simpler and in its own way more unsettling than any conspiracy theory ever invented. The toxic lady case never really ended for the people who lived it. Even after the 1997 paper from Lawrence Livermore laid everything out in black and white, the staff who collapsed that night still carry the scars, some physical, most invisible. Susan Kane, the nurse who drew the first syringe, left emergency medicine within a year. Maureen Welch, the respiratory therapist who convulsed on the floor, still wakes up some nights tasting garlic and ammonia. Dr. Humberto Ochoa kept practicing, but refused to speak about February 19, 1994, for the rest of his career. They had stared into the unknown, felt their bodies betray them in a room full of trained professionals, and then watched the world call it mass hysteria until cold chemistry finally proved otherwise. Their fear was never imaginary. Their courage, staying behind in borrowed hazmat suits to keep shocking a dying woman's heart while their own lungs burned, was never in doubt. Science explained the toxin. It never diminished the terror. 32 years later, the story still circulates, whispered in medical forums, replayed on true crime podcasts, debated on late-night conspiracy streams. Why? Because medical mysteries like this one expose the thin, fragile line between the everyday and the catastrophic. We like to believe our hospitals are fortresses of certainty. White coats, monitors, protocols. Then one ordinary Saturday night, a dying woman rolls through the doors, carrying nothing more exotic than a jar of pain cream from the health food store, and the entire system collapses. No glowing vials, no secret lab. Just chemistry doing what chemistry does when the conditions line up exactly wrong. That randomness is scarier than any government plot or alien implant. It tells us the world is full of invisible tripwires we walk past every day. Conspiracy theories bloom in the gap between what we feel and what we can prove. When 23 trained professionals drop like dominoes and the first official answer is, "You imagined it," the mind rebels. It reaches for the dramatic explanation because the quiet one feels insulting. A dying woman accidentally turning into a chemical weapon because of a home remedy. Too small, too mundane. It robs the event of meaning. So we invent bioweapons, cover-ups, extraterrestrial residue, anything that restores order and purpose to the chaos. Psychologists call it the need for cognitive closure. When the official story feels inadequate, the brain fills the void with narrative. The toxic lady became a modern folktale precisely because the truth arrived late and in the driest scientific journal imaginable. By then, the legend had already taken root. Yet the science does not mock the believers. It honors the mystery by solving it without erasing the wonder. Dimethyl sulfate is real. The oxidation pathway is real. The sulfate spike in Gloria's tissues is real. But so is the human impulse to look for something bigger when the lights go out and people start falling. That impulse built cathedrals, launched rockets, and sometimes drives us to dangerous places. The same curiosity that once made us fear witches and curses now makes us fear shadow governments and suppressed files. It is the same mind, just updated hardware. The lesson is not that conspiracy thinkers are foolish. The lesson is that we are all wired to seek patterns when the pattern is missing. And sometimes the pattern really is there, hiding in plain sight inside a jar of DMSO cream. Gloria Cecilia Ramirez was not a monster. She was a 31-year-old mother fighting for every extra day. She rubbed something on her skin that millions of other pain patients have used before and since. Her body, already coming apart at the seams, turned that remedy into something lethal under conditions no one could have predicted. The hospital did not cover anything up. It simply lacked the right test at the right moment. The coroner did not lie. He followed the evidence he had, and the staff who risked their lives to save her were never hysterical. They were exposed to a real, volatile gas that modern detectors of 1994 were never designed to catch. The story leaves us with one small, lingering question that science cannot quite close. If a common, over-the-counter pain cream could accidentally turn one desperate patient into a temporary chemical hazard inside a busy emergency room, what other ordinary substances are one unexpected reaction, one failing organ, one perfect storm away from something we still do not fully understand? The universe is not malicious. It is simply indifferent, and in that indifference lies the real mystery. The toxic lady walked into Riverside General Hospital on a quiet February evening in 1994 and walked out in 3 body bags under police escort. She left behind 23 injured caregivers, a sealed trauma bay, and a legend that refuses to die. But she also left behind the quiet truth that sometimes the scariest monsters are not sent by governments or visitors from the stars. Sometimes they are born in the ordinary chemistry of a human body pushed to its limit. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling explanation of all.